There we go. Success. So yes, good morning. Welcome to the information session for stabilization grants at the Winnipeg Foundation. A couple of housekeeping notes to get things started. First of all, my name is Megan Tate and I'm Director of Community Grants at the Winnipeg Foundation. As we've mentioned, today's session is going to be recorded for people who weren't able to join us this morning. It'll be available on our website and through our social media channels. For those who just really liked it and want to watch it again, you'll also be able to do that via the recording. We have close to 200 people registered for today's call. So we do want to ask that you make sure that you keep your microphone on mute just to avoid any background sounds and that kind of thing. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we invite you to use the chat feature. We've set aside some time at the end to answer the questions that come up through the chat feature. If your questions are really specific to your organization's circumstances, we ask you to contact a member of our grants team directly, and we'd be happy to chat through those questions with you. But if you have more general questions about the Stabilization Grants program, pop those in the chat and we'll try to get those answered for you. So if we were meeting in person, which I really wish we were, I'd begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on Treaty 1 territory. So I still would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 1, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe, and the Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. And so I'd like to invite you all to take a moment to reflect on the land where you are today. The other thing that I wanted to do before I dive into the presentation is just to check in on you all. We are heading into the 1-year anniversary of COVID-19 and the global pandemic and the lockdowns that we've all experienced. And so I know it's just been a really challenging time for all of us, both personally and professionally, and especially for those of you working in the charitable sector. It's been a time of great uncertainty and challenges. And so just want to acknowledge that and check in on all of you and know that the Winnipeg Foundation is so grateful for the work that all of you do in our community. The other thing that I would do if we were all gathered in a room together is I'd do a shout out to some of my colleagues on the grants team. So instead, I'm going to do a virtual introduction of everybody who works with me at the Foundation in grants. So first up, starting from the left, that's me. Kayla, Anna, and Andrea, if you have questions about our online grant application or grant payments, it's Kayla, Anna, and Andrea that you've probably connected with or had emails with. The balance of our grants team, Neneth, Bridget, Noah, Aaliyah, Carrie, and Joanna are our grants associates. Each has their own portfolio. Aaliyah is our youth engagement coordinator, and so she coordinates our youth and philanthropy program, as well as our summer internship program and other youth initiatives that we have at the Winnipeg Foundation. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We wanted to give you a little bit of an update on what's happening just generally at the Winnipeg Foundation, tell you about our COVID-19 response to date, talk a little bit about all of our granting in 2021, and then finally give you some information about stabilization grants. So about the foundation, you may have heard that 2021 is a milestone for the Winnipeg Foundation as we're celebrating our 100th anniversary. The gentleman that you see on your screen, that is a bust of William Alloway. He's the founder of the Winnipeg Foundation. His initial gift of $100,000 is what created us as Canada's first community foundation. As you can imagine, we're not going to be celebrating our 100th as we had intended due to COVID and the need to reallocate some of our funding dollars to more pressing needs in our community. But there's still things that we're doing to celebrate. Some of you might have seen that we sponsored the Centennial Trail at the Forks this year, and we know that hundreds, probably thousands of Winnipeggers were able to enjoy walking, skating, and skiing down at the Forks. And certainly watch for other activities that we'll be hosting over the course of the year. Another thing that you might know about the foundation is you've probably heard that our longtime CEO, Rick Frost, is stepping down in April. Rick's been with the foundation for close to 24 years, and we've all benefited from Rick's wisdom and his leadership. I know personally, I've just enjoyed being able to work with Rick all of these years, but we're also really excited to welcome Sky Bridges to the role. So I know once Sky starts that all of you will look forward to the opportunity to meet and connect with him. Another change that we wanted to share that'll be relevant specifically to grants is that we're going to be upgrading our online grant application system. It's going to be a lot more user-friendly. There's going to be features that I think will really benefit community organizations. For example, you'll both be able to apply and submit your final reports through the online portal. But we also know that there will be a learning curve, both for us as staff and for you as grant applicants. So stay tuned for more information about that new grants management system. For the upcoming intake for stabilization grants, we'll still be using our existing online system. So if you are planning to apply for a major capital grant or a community grant in the fall, you'll likely be using that new system. So just stay tuned for more details about that. And the final thing to share is, as you can tell, most staff is still working from home. So the best way to get in touch with us is by email. If you don't know who specifically to contact, you can send an email to either grants@wpgfdn.org or covidgrants@wpgfdn.org. So a little bit about our COVID response to date. In the earliest days of COVID, we started providing grants to frontline organizations that work with those who were most impacted by the shutdowns. Between March 13th and June 2nd, we awarded over $2.5 million to those community organizations. And so you'll see the gentleman on the screen, he benefited from a meal delivery program that was funded through one of the Winnipeg Foundation's COVID grants. So just a fun little photo to share with you all today. We also partnered with the federal government to administer the Emergency Community Support Fund. And through that initiative, we were able to grant an additional $2.3 million to community organizations. And then finally, last spring, we launched the first round of stabilization grants. Through that initiative, we were able to provide $8.9 million to 279 community organizations. This amount was bolstered by support from our donor advisors. And so just a note to say that we know that the pandemic is affecting community organizations, but in sometimes different ways. For example, we know that frontline agencies are seeing an increased demand for your services, including food, employment supports, access to programs that reduce social isolation and address mental health. For other organizations, so for the performing arts or recreation organizations, we know that you've had to cancel programming because it's not adhering to current public health guidelines. So we know it's affecting the sector in different ways, but I don't think there's any organization or community that hasn't been touched by COVID and adhering to the health guidelines. We also know that things are changing really quickly. And so our role as a grants team is to keep an ear to the ground, to check in with you as community organizations, to keep up to date with information that's shared by Imagine Canada and other thought leaders. Last fall, our CEO, Rick, hosted a series of conversations, again via Zoom, just to hear directly from community organizations how COVID has been impacting you. And all of these conversations have informed our 2021 Stabilization Grants program. And the final thing I want to share is that the Winnipeg Foundation is actively working with all of our donors who've really stepped up to support our community. So many of our donors provided some of those initial COVID emergency support grants, as well as were part of our stabilization grants initiative. So for example, our original budget for stabilization grants was around $6 million. And because our donor advisor stepped up to the place, we were able to grant almost 9. So that's a 50% increase. Really thanks to our donor advisors. This is a slide that I always like to share with people. So in January, the Winnipeg Foundation announced the results of our 2020 granting year, and we were excited to share that we were able to distribute $73 million to 1,000 charities in our community and in fact across Canada. And I think when a lot of people think of the Winnipeg Foundation, they really think of what we call our responsive grants. So those are the grants where you fill out an application, submit it to the foundation, it's reviewed by our grants committee or other committees that we have, and grants are awarded that way. But as you can see from the chart, less than a quarter of our grants are actually allocated in response to applications. That by far the largest chunk of our grant dollars go out from agency and designated funds. And so those are funds where either community organizations themselves or donors have established a fund where the annual income goes back to the charity of their choice. So you can see that that's a significant portion of our granting. Another growing part of the foundation's granting is what we call donor advised grant making, and that's where a donor has a fund at the Winnipeg Foundation and they decide each year where their grant dollars are going to go. And then you can see some of the other ways that our funding goes out, including leadership activities, so things like our Youth and Philanthropy program, things like our public art program at the Forks. We have a scholarship program, and as well as Endow Manitoba, we do support a number of community foundations across Manitoba. So just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of how our grant dollars break down. That said, our responsive grant budget for 2021 has actually increased over previous years. So we will have approximately $17 million to grant across all of our responsive grant programs. And it's possible that this amount will be further augmented by our donor advisors. So a little bit about what our granting in 2021 looks like. We know that the need for funding in our community is significant, and so we do anticipate that all of our intakes will be quite competitive. Our first intake of the year in September, we received twice as many applications as we normally would, and the amount requested was 3 times what we had available to grant. So we certainly know that the demand is there. Our grants committee works really hard to make sure they're addressing immediate needs, but also making sure that the foundation's funding is dispersed through our community across all of the Winnipeg Foundation's 5 causes. In terms of what's coming for the rest of the year, stabilization grants, which is the purpose of our call today, we will have a second intake for one-time community grants in the fall, and many of our special granting programs, including professional development and org development grants, literacy for life, nourishing potential, are continuing as scheduled. Our response to COVID has affected some of our application dates, so we just encourage you to check our website to get the latest information about all of our application dates for each of our special granting programs. The final thing I wanted to share with you today, because we do get a lot of questions about this. In 2020, we had planned to launch Resilient Community Grants, which was building on our pilot program of multi-year grants that was launched in 2017. However, due to COVID, we didn't offer the program last year. Because of the size of those grants, there's fewer organizations that receive them. And because of COVID, we knew that we wanted to create funding that was as flexible as possible and also that reaches as many community organizations as possible. We've also postponed Resilient Community Grants for this year, again, given the pandemic and given the launch of our Stabilization Grants program. We know this is disappointing, and we're hoping to reinstate multi-year grants sometime in the future, but with all of the uncertainty in our community, we're just not sure when that might be. So a little bit of an overview about what Stabilization Grants is going to look like in 2021. So it's largely the same as it was last year. The total available this year is $8 million. Applications will be due at the end of March. And once again, the maximum request is $50,000. and requests to the foundation through stabilization grants must be COVID related. A little bit about eligibility. Like all grant programs at the Winnipeg Foundation, to be eligible, your organization must be a registered charity. And the grant program is open to all Winnipeg-based organizations whose programs benefit the citizens of Winnipeg. Applications will also be accepted from provincial or national organizations who have Winnipeg-based staff delivering programs to Winnipeggers. Organizations can only submit one stabilization grant in 2021. You're eligible to apply for a stabilization grant even if you have other outstanding grants with the Winnipeg Foundation, including COVID emergency grants, community grants, or if you received a stabilization grant last year. If you did receive a stabilization grant in 2020, this week you'll likely receive a copy of the survey that we're sending out to all grant recipients. And just want to make note that you're not required to submit that prior to applying for a stabilization grant in 2021. Certainly we'd appreciate your response by April 30th. What we're learning from your applications and from your survey responses are really going to inform the Foundation's grant making going forward. But just want to clarify that there's no requirements that you submit previous final reports before applying for a stabilization grant. And the final thing that we want to make sure that you know is that having a stabilization grant will not impact your ability to apply for other foundation grants in the future. Again, including our one-time community grants in the fall, our major capital grants, or any of our special granting programs. So a little bit about the types of funding. So once again, stabilization grants will provide short-term unrestricted support to support your organization through the financial impact of COVID. So losses or costs that you have incurred will be considered retroactively. And we recognize that your organizations are all going to be in different situations, again, depending on your area of service, depending on what your primary sources of funding, whether you rely primarily on government or whether you rely on fundraising, earned revenue. And also, you know, some organizations, how much they had to pivot their program, all of those things will be unique to your organization's circumstances. The other thing we want to highlight is that we do know that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted some racialized groups and has brought systemic discrimination to the forefront. So that's also something that we're mindful of as we launch this second round of stabilization grants. So what you can see on the screen are just some examples of the types of support we think your organization might need, but we know that you might have other COVID-related needs that we haven't necessarily thought of. So again, at the end of the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask some general questions. And if you have questions specific to your organization, please feel free to reach out. It's equally important for us to be clear about what's not eligible for funding. So ineligible requests include regular programming or projects unrelated to COVID-19. So those types of projects will not be eligible for a stabilization grant. However, we will be holding a call for proposals for one-time community grants in the fall, and that'll be open to all kinds of projects that are going on in our community. The other types of requests that are ineligible are financial losses unrelated to COVID-19. So we know that organizations are facing financial challenges, including funding cuts unrelated to the global pandemic. However, this funding program is specifically to address the financial impacts of COVID. So a little bit about how you can apply for a stabilization grant. As I mentioned, it will be online through our existing online grants application system. We've designed the application to be fairly simple. We're not requiring attachments, although as part of the review process, we may request additional information or supporting documentation, especially if we haven't, if you haven't recently applied to the Winnipeg Foundation. So many of you that have recently applied to the Winnipeg Foundation, we've got a lot of your information on file, but if we don't have recent information, we may reach out and request a little bit more. So some of the basic information that we're going to be looking for is a brief description of your organization. This just helps us understand you and the work that you do. We're looking for an organization contact information, as well as the amount that you're requesting from the Winnipeg Foundation and the cause area that best reflects the work of your organization. We'll also ask for information about the person that we can contact if we have any questions about your proposal, again, as part of that review process. After we've gotten all the basic information out of the way, we've got just 4 questions that we're looking for a little bit more information on. So the first question relates to the current current financial situation for your organization and how you've been impacted by COVID in the last 12 months. So in this section, we're looking for you to be as specific as possible. So for example, do you anticipate that you'll have a surplus or a deficit at the end of this fiscal year? And what's contributed to that situation? Have you seen a decrease in funding or donations, or perhaps you've actually seen an increase in revenue because of some of the federal support programs or other funding initiatives that have been developed in response to COVID? So you might not actually be in a deficit at the end of this year, again, because some of those federal support programs, or maybe you've had to lay off staff or haven't incurred as many programming costs as you anticipated. On the flip side, you may be in a deficit position because your longtime gala fundraiser wasn't able to go forward as you'd originally planned. I did note that the Prime Minister, I think just yesterday, announced that the federal wage subsidy is going to be extended until the end of June. And I know that a lot of charitable organizations have been able to access specifically that funding. So all of this information just helps us give us a fuller picture of the current situation at your organization. It's a little bit tricky. We know that each organization's fiscal year could vary, although many of you will have a March 31st year end. So what we're hoping is that you'll do a slight projection for how you anticipate that you're going to finish this fiscal year ending March 31st, 2021. For those of you with a December year end or other year ends, you'll have different information that you're able to share. One thing that I want to note is that having a surplus does not impact your eligibility for funding. We understand that many organizations are going to continue to face uncertainty into the future. And so while your financial statements might reflect a situation today, we know that there's a lot of uncertainty about the future. And so our stabilization grants are just as much about looking forward as they are looking back at the last year. Our second question is more about the work that we do. And so we're interested to know how the pandemic has affected the work of your organization, whether you've seen an increase in demand of services, whether you've had to reduce the services you're able to provide, again, due to current health restrictions, just a sense of how COVID has impacted the programming side of the work that you do. And this question, your answer to this question will just give us a sense of your organization's present operating capacity. The third piece of information that we're looking for is wanting to know how a grant from the Winnipeg Foundation will move your organization forward. We know that the situation is rapidly changing, and so what you think your organization's future looks like as of today could certainly change again as circumstances in our community change. But we are interested in knowing for how your organization could use this funding to move forward. So while our first round of stabilization grants really focused on immediate, sudden losses in funding that charitable organizations experienced, or very quick, unexpected expenses that you incurred. Stabilization Grants in 2021 is also about looking to the future. How will support from the Winnipeg Foundation help your organization move forward in these uncertain times? So that'll be some of the information that we're looking for. And finally, we've just given you an open-ended question. Is there anything else that you'd want the Winnipeg Foundation to know about your organization and your current circumstances? I have to share that some of the most interesting information in the first round of stabilization grants actually came through the answer to this question. So we wanted to leave in an open-ended opportunity for you to share any other information that you think would be relevant or that you wanted us to know. So a little bit about how we will assess the stabilization grant application. So there's a number of factors that will influence our funding decisions, but I just want to reiterate that we've really designed it to be as flexible as possible, both because we know that circumstances are going to be different depending on the work and the circumstances of your organization, and also because we know that circumstances are continuing to change in our community. But that said, there are a few key areas that we will be looking at. So our assessment will be based on the content of the application, our knowledge of your organization, and any additional information that we request from you as part of the review process. So some of the things that we will consider is just a financial assessment of your organization. Something that's always a consideration when the Winnipeg Foundation is reviewing grant applications is your organization's grant history. So looking at whether you received a stabilization grant last year, whether you've received a community grant this year. Again, those won't negatively impact your opportunity to apply for funding. It's just part of the financial assessment that we do as part of our review process. We'll also be doing an organizational assessment, looking at things like your work in your community, the stability of your organization, governance, how is your board supporting your organization through these times, that kind of thing. We'll also be looking at whether your group is led by or serves diverse communities. So I think we know, and in fact, I think that the province released some data earlier this week that COVID has been disproportionately affecting BIPOC members of our community, so as well as people with disabilities, seniors, and women. And we also know that historically, Indigenous-led organizations and organizations led by other BIPOC members of our community have received a disproportionately lower share of philanthropic dollars. So all of those factors will certainly be part of our assessment of the stabilization grants. And the final thing that we'll be looking at is the projected impact of that grant. So that's that forward-looking piece that I spoke about earlier in terms of how will support from the Winnipeg Foundation move your organization forward and help you manage some of the uncertainty of these very unusual times. Other factors that will determine our funding decisions include simply the number of applications in context of the budget that we have available. So we know that the need is great, and we do anticipate, again, receiving a lot of applications, so it will be a competitive process. And stabilization grants are intended to support the organizations working across all 5 cause areas that the Winnipeg Foundation supports. So that's organizations working in the areas of children, youth, and families, arts, culture, and heritage, health, wellness, and recreation, environment, literacy, education, and employment. Just knowing that you work with the work of diverse community organizations to ensure we're meeting our vision of a Winnipeg where community life flourishes for all. Oh, sorry, I missed a couple things there. The final thing to note is that we anticipate that some of our other donor advisors may wish to be part of this funding initiative as well. And so some of our funding will depend on what their interests are as donors.
Meg?
Yeah.
We just have a few questions related to fiscal year and that kind of thing. Do you want to address those at the end, or would you like to address them now?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind getting through the
Okay.
presentation and covering all the questions at the end.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I just have a few more slides, so we can get to the questions at the end. Yeah, so these are some of the other factors that will influence our ability to provide funding. And I should note that one of the most common questions we get is, do you think that my proposal will be funded? And that's hard for us to answer at any time, but in the particular circumstances that we're in, it's almost impossible for us to answer. We simply don't know. And again, we've kept the eligibility criteria as broad as possible as we continue to learn the full scope of how the charitable sector has been impacted over the last year. So a little bit of information about submitting your grant application. As I'd mentioned, applications must be submitted online via our website. Applications are due on Wednesday, March 31st, promptly at 4:30 p.m. I should note that that deadline is firm and we won't be able to accept late applications. If you have an in-progress application, when 4:30 comes around, unfortunately, that application will be lost. So we do encourage everybody to submit your application at least a few minutes before the 4:30 p.m. deadline, more if you can. Sometimes it can take a few minutes for an application to go through, depending on your Wi-Fi speed and another number of other factors. Technology is, precarious sometimes. So last minute equipment failures, connection problems, technical issues do happen. And so we do encourage you to get your application in advance of that 4:30 p.m. deadline. And we hope to have a decision in early July for all applicants. So for those of you who haven't applied to the Winnipeg Foundation before, or if your organization has, but you haven't been the one to submit the application, a couple of things to note. You will need to know, if you're brand new, you'll have to set up an account in the system. If you as an individual are new, you will need to know the email address that is used for your organization to submit online applications, as well as the password. If you know the email address, but not the password, we do have a forgot password feature so that you can get that. Should also note that the application does have a save and finish later function, so you don't have to complete the whole application all in one sitting. If you start an application and want to go back and finish it later, don't click the Apply Now button. Instead, you should find the Go to Your Account feature. And finally, once your application is complete, please make sure that you click Review and Submit. Any missing information will be highlighted for you to review. And when complete, there's one last time that you have to click Submit. So make sure that you do that. So it's important to note that the Winnipeg Foundation can't see your application until you've actually clicked that Submit button. You'll know that you're successful because you'll receive an auto email from the system confirming that your application has been submitted. So that's the end of my presentation, and it sounds like there's some great questions already happening in the chat, so I'm happy to answer those now.
Meg, there's a couple of questions here, as Joe mentioned, around year end. So one group with a year end, fiscal year end, August 31st, another with July 31st. So just wondering how to handle capturing those losses. The question is, may we include losses in past actual year, noting that the April 2020 to March 2021, 12 months crosses 2 fiscal years for them?
Yes, absolutely. And that was a tricky thing for us, acknowledging that everybody has different fiscal year ends. So yeah, really what we want to know is how you've been impacted the last 12 months. And so if that does cross 2 fiscal years for your organization, knowing that that fiscal year end is really just a snapshot in time, absolutely make sure that you can share your financial information with the foundation that crosses your 2 fiscal years.
Okay, another fiscal year question. Sorry, I've just got this one here. Our fiscal year end is December. Can we submit the financials from January to December 2020? So that would capture most of a year during COVID.
Yeah, I think if you have a December fiscal year end, you will have a very precise number for how you finished out your fiscal year. So you could share that. But if you do have some preliminary information about your first 3 years, the first 3 months of the current fiscal year, you may wish to include that as well.
Okay, here's a question from Christina G. If you have an existing program that has extended services to provide COVID-specific relief, so a program that was already running, but you've had to change it a little bit to adapt to COVID, will it be considered, or would this be fall under an existing program that would be ineligible?
Yeah, so again, we're trying to be as flexible as possible. And so we know that many organizations have had to adapt your programs either to work within existing circumstances or to provide additional programming to meet the demands created by COVID. And so all of those factors would be considered as part of our Stabilization Grants program.
Okay. Question here from Stars of Promise. Is this grant different from the government grant of $25,000? I'm not sure if that's provincial or federal, but can we apply for both?
So the Winnipeg Foundation is completely separate from government funding. So yes, you can absolutely apply for Winnipeg Foundation support in addition to government program funding.
Okay, Yvette Crane is wondering if they can see the full list of the grant questions in a PDF format.
That is not currently available, but if you send an email to our COVID grants email address, we can reply with the questions. At the end of the day, though, you will still need to submit your application online via the online application portal. And there is that save and finish later function. So if you do want to just go in and take a peek at the questions, you can do that and you don't have to fill it out all at once.
Okay, question from Scott Forbes. If COVID has highlighted a community need for a program, such as infant childcare, could expanding services be considered for this grant?
Yeah, that's a great question. As we know, COVID has highlighted a lot of inequity in our community and has shown some gaps in services. I think it will be certainly a bit of a case-by-case basis, but if you can make the case that your organization is doing something impacted or related to COVID, that we would certainly consider an application for that. I think one of the challenges is through our community grants program, if someone's coming to us with an idea for a new program that they'd like to do, one of the questions that we always want to know is how do you intend to sustain that program after Winnipeg Foundation funding has ended? And so if you are proposing a brand new program as part of your stabilization grant, you'll want to put some thought into that as well. So just some things to consider.
Okay, if you had a stabilization grant in 2020, are you still able to apply in 2021?
Yes, absolutely. You are still eligible to apply this year, even if you received a stabilization grant last year.
Okay, now here's a question around fundraising. It notes that in the past, the salary of fundraisers has been ineligible for granting programs. Would we consider fundraising as part of a sustainability planning project related to COVID?
So at the end of the day, the stabilization grants are unrestricted funding. So we're not necessarily funding a specific program or project. But again, if you think a part of the questions we have are forward-looking, how will support from the Winnipeg Foundation move your organization forward? So if you believe that fundraising support is one way to move your organization forward, you can certainly reflect that in your answers to the questions. I think we would want to know if this is a brand new position for your organization or if it's a function that you currently have. It is, I will say it is, it probably is a little bit of a gray area given that we have not funded fundraising positions in the past. So that might be something we'll need to talk through a little bit more. Sorry, that was not a super clear answer. Maybe the best thing is to follow up with a member of our grants team after, if that's your organization's specific circumstances.
Okay, returning to the financial information, do we require audited financials or financials that are reviewed or something a little bit more, I was going to say casual, that's not the right word, something less official?
Yeah, so the grant application was designed to be as streamlined as possible. So we're not actually asking for any attachments. It's really whatever you put in the answer to question number 1 on the application. Again, we do ask that you be as specific as possible. So thinking back to the last example of those that have, for example, a December year end, if you say, you know, as of our year end, December 31st, this was our surplus or deficit, and then this is what we anticipate for the first 3 months of 2021. That said, the foundation may request additional supporting documentation from your organization, and that could include some financial statements. But that would be whatever financial statements your organization has available, whether it's audited, a review engagement, something signed by your board treasurer, just whatever the most kind of formal financial statements that your organization has available. But that's not a requirement for application. That's just something we may request as part of the review process.
Okay, sorry, I'm just reading here as we go. Question from Rick Brownlee. How about maintaining staff throughout this pandemic to avoid losing decades of experience and talent?
Yeah,
group
absolutely.
That relies a lot on fundraising.
Yeah, so absolutely. We know that staffing has been an incredible challenge for the charitable sector over the last year, as has volunteers. We know many of you rely on volunteers to make your programs happen. So yes, that we would consider any kind of funding related to staffing. I think we would also be interested to know as part of that if your organization has benefited from any of the wage subsidy programs provided by the federal government.
Okay, same question. They also noted that they are redoing their space while they're closed over COVID. I'm not sure if this is a question around eligibility for some of those renovation costs, but could you speak to that as an option?
Yeah, so again, the stabilization grants are really intended to be unrestricted funds. So if you did some renovations over the course of the past year, that will be part of the reason for why your financial picture is the way that it is. So you can certainly include that information in the application. But because the stabilization grant is unrestricted, it's not like Winnipeg Foundation funding would go specifically to cover renovations that have already been completed. Does that make sense?
What about partial grants for this program? Would the foundation consider partial amounts in the case that the intake is very competitive?
Yes, that's a great question. Just like all of the Winnipeg Foundation's grant programs, it's not an all or nothing proposition. If we cannot meet the full amount of your request and we think that partial support would still make a meaningful difference, that we would absolutely consider providing a lesser amount than what was requested.
Okay, kind of a similar question here to one you've already answered, but would a grant cover only some components of a proposed project?
So again, the funding will be really unrestricted funding for the organization, but any kind of expenses or costs that you've incurred that have contributed to your organization's current financial picture are things that you could certainly tell us about as part of your application.
Okay. Well, we're caught up here for now, unless people are typing, which is entirely possible.
And I'll just acknowledge it is, you know, if you've been to these info sessions before, you've probably heard me say many times that the Winnipeg Foundation is a project funder, that we fund specific projects for a specific period of time. So this is a different space for us to be in. And I'll confess that even for me, it's hard to kind of get out of that project funder mode. But in terms of what we've been learning about the challenges that the sector is facing, we know that what's required most right now is just flexible funding, things to keep the lights on, things to keep your staff working. And so that's why the program was designed to be, again, as kind of flexible and open as possible, and that once the grants are awarded, that the funding will truly be unrestricted. So when we ask kind of how you might allocate the funds, that's really just to give us a picture of where your organization is at and how you're thinking about the future. So I don't know if that provides some helpful guidance in terms of preparing your proposal and just also thinking about what might be eligible or not eligible for funding. Probably the simplest way to think about it is if it's related to COVID, if it's something that has impacted your organization because of COVID, that's what we want to hear about in your application. Any other questions come through the chat, Carrie?
Just one here right now about relocation costs. This one looks pretty specific. Relocation costs for a center that is needing to renovate to open new childcare spaces.
Yeah, so again, if that does sound quite specific, so you may want to reach out to a member of our grants team to discuss your circumstances. Capital projects are primarily probably best served by applying for a one-time community grant. Again, we know that some organizations have had to make COVID-related retrofits to your space. So yeah, if you have specific renovation needs, I'd encourage you maybe to reach out to a member of our grants team directly, and we can guide you through that.
Okay, not seeing anything else right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this morning. As we've said, that our grants team is always accessible if you've got questions specific to your organization's circumstances. Once we've had a chance to upload this session to our website and our social media platforms, there's an opportunity for you to watch it again if there's something that you feel that you missed. But we really do appreciate you all spending this time with us this morning. So we hope you have a good rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing your proposals at the end of March.